Welcome, dear students. I am going to talk about the use of Middle English in writing. I hope and expect that by the end of this session, you would be able to understand what were the processes through which the use of Middle English in writing started, what were the causes, and how it gradually took over the use of other languages. Well, logically speaking, in gaining the currency for any language, the final step probably is its use in writing. English language in the Middle English period had already gained currency in the spoken form. It was being used by masses. It was being used by masses not only in their everyday life, but gradually towards the middle of the Middle Ages, it had taken over the domains such as courts of law, such as religion, and other administrative and governmental areas. Now, this was the time that logically it would be used for writing in everyday usage. However, this was not something very simple. This was something not very easy. This was really tough. Can you really guess why it was tough? What were the reasons that made it tough? Well, my dear students, the answer is it was tough because here it had to face a competition. It had a competition with Latin and French languages. As far as Latin language is concerned, it had been used in writing since so long that it gave a tough competition to any other language in England. Why Latin had been used? Well, there were certain reasons. Partly as a habit formed at a time when most people who could write at all would write in Latin language. Partly due to its international character. Talking of its international character, I would say it was almost like the same as, not exactly, but to some extent, English has. The third reason was the feeling that it was a language that had become fixed over the time. Its grammar, its structure, its vocabulary was far more fixed, and it had regulations as compared to the other languages such as English that were unregulated. Well, my dear students, modern languages began to encroach upon writing in Latin at a time when French was still the language of the educated class and of aristocracy. So, in England at that time, 3 languages were being used: Latin, French, and English. English was being used for everyday conversations and gradually was taking over certain domains of life in the formal spheres. French was also being used. From everyday usage, it had become a language that would be used in more formalized situations, and it had become a language of fashion and style. And Latin was a language of literature. This was a language that was used for writing formal writings. In all this situation, French language was the first language of most of the people of England, in the sense that all the aristocracy and all the royalty had French language as their mother tongue. French language thus was being spoken, but it had a dispute with Latin language when it came to writing. So, mainly, Latin was being used for writing and French was being used for spoken purposes before English took over in writing. When we move towards the 15th century, English succeeds in displacing both of these languages. In private and semi-official correspondence, French is at its height about 1350. The earliest English records of writing in any such situations that we find are somewhere around 1400. In fact, the earliest English letters appear in the latter part of the century. However, just a few records are available from the beginning of the century. However, it was after 1450 that we find that English in writing gained currency, which means letters were found everywhere written in English language. This was not restricted to letters only. This was the case with wills as well. Adoption of English for official records could be noticed at that time. English for the records of towns and guilds was also found. It was about 1430 a number of towns translated their ordinances and their books of customs into English language. Thus, English becomes general in all the transactions, especially the written transactions, the formal transactions from 1450 onwards. Well, apparently the brilliant victories of the English over the French at Agincourt gave the English a pride in the things English. So, as you know, a language is what the people of that language are. The more the people own the language, the greater it gets currency. Same happened to English. The end of this reign at the beginning of the next marks the period at which English begins to be generally developed as writing proper. If we want to give a round number, I would say 1425 represents the exact date in this regard.